Welcome to the PRovoke Media Podcast. I'm Renee Connolly, Head of Content Partnerships here at PRovoke. And with us today, our CEO of Red Havas Group and Global Chairman, James Wright, and Merck KGaA's Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, Renee Connolly. In this episode, we'll be continuing to examine the themes of purpose, specifically in light of the potential upcoming economic downturn. We'll also discuss the themes of holding companies accountable to their purpose-related promises and the intersection of professional and personal purpose, which is on the rise. James and Renee, thank you so much for both being here.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
Yeah, James, would you quickly introduce yourself and then also just kind of let us know, we've talked in one episode before, but would love to hear from you on where this conversation is going to take us and Red Havas's continued work in this space.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Megan. As you point out, I'm the global CEO of Red Havas and the global chair of the Havas PR Global Collective. We are a team of about 1,300 consultants working in PR and public affairs all around the world, supporting and counseling clients in pretty much every industry, as well as government agencies and NGOs. And we've done a huge amount of work in this space in terms of purpose, and particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, we've been producing a number of reports that have looked at this both pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and now as we look hopefully to be in a post-pandemic world very soon. It's a topic that's really kind of like, I think, important to us personally. It's important to our clients, and increasingly it's important to the society and communities in which we operate. So delighted to be back here to be able to discuss this a little bit more. And I'm also delighted to welcome one of our fantastic clients and a brilliant communication leader in Renee Connolly, who joins us today from Merck KGaA.
Thanks so much, James. Thanks so much, Megan, for having me. It's wonderful. So I am indeed Renee Connolly here in my capacity as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany. We operate globally, 70,000 people worldwide, business specialties in the biopharma, life science, and electronics arena. And it's exciting. I am 18 years on my journey with the organization and just took on this responsibility about a year ago at the request of our newly appointed chairwoman, Belén Guerrejo, who asked me if I would be willing to, even though I'm a communications person by competency, take my passion for purpose to the next level and help our organization move forward and really take to light what it means to build a more inclusive workplace at Merck and our organization, and what it's going to take for us to move the needle in living the purpose every single day. So thrilled to be here. Very excited to share this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you both. I think this is just an exciting conversation, as we've been building so much all year on the topic of purpose in many conversations. But the putting it to action, the measurement of it, the quantification of it, and the qualification of it all have such different meanings and where we can go. And I think it's an interesting time to actually be qualifying what it is that we're doing and how we're keeping companies accountable, how we're documenting that success and that progress. James, I know that you've been working with partners kind of in this space, and I'm interested in hearing a little more from you about some of what we're starting to see in terms of measuring and tracking where the needle goes on some of these things. And if you're seeing trends, if you're seeing, if you have predictions about like what are going to be those measures that really stick.
Yeah, sure, Megan. So I think, to think about what's happening today and what's going to happen in the future, we also have to kind of look back and see kind of where we've come from. And we discussed some of this last time when we went through kind of the previous podcast. We've been following this topic for many years and looking how really it's been, disrupted, rethought, redefined, and actually kind of reset, particularly during the global pandemic. But even before the global pandemic erupted and the outpouring of support for greater social justice and the resulting protests, as well as the even more polarizing nature of politics, consumers were applying more pressure on brands to demonstrate their purpose and take a stance on issues that mattered to their stakeholders. How can they do well as a business as well as doing good at the same time? And so we started looking at how purpose was being redefined as one of the key themes in one of our predictions, our Spread Sky Predictions report in 2020. And that's our annual report that looks at predicting what issues business and society would be focusing on in communications that year and beyond. And it's come up in every report since. Indeed, we produced 2 or 3 other white papers that specifically dealt with the issue of purpose, called From Pledges to Progress. And of course, there are many genuine leaders in the ESG space delivering on corporate purpose, but we also need to recognize there's also a great cynicism from certain quarters about some of the claims, pledges, and real world outcomes, or lack thereof, of business in other spaces. Indeed, one Financial Times journalist said that when they read most businesses' ESG claims, that the ESG should stand for eye roll, sneer, and groan. So the past few years has really seen ESG, though, come back onto the agenda in a big and redefined way. Despite the current rising energy prices, climate change, and global conflict, it remains really at the top of the agenda. And I guess what we're going to see now in the future is that purpose pressure tested again as we potentially enter into some economic headwinds. And it's not just in terms of how we are managing the business and from a outward perspective and all of your stakeholders that are external, but very importantly now it's also about proving your purpose and your commitments to ESG to internal audiences, because beyond influencing how people buy, purpose, or the reality is that purpose has also begun to have a bearing on where people work. And as a proof point of that, a recent study by Deloitte, for example, found that 2 out of 3 millennials, 2 out of 3, and this is a generation that will comprise approximately 75% of the global workforce by 2025, will primarily choose an employer because of its purpose.
Renee, that builds so well into some of the previous conversations that we've had, highlighting this intersection of professional and personal purpose and mission-driven involvement and engagement, both in a company and as consumers. So we've seen a lot of this pattern demonstrated by consumers, but now our employees are also thinking about where they work and where they engage in a similar way. And I'm curious, like at Merck KGaA, are you finding in your practice and as you unroll these types of initiatives, an influence there for the type of work and engagement that you're hoping for?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, Megan. And I can't agree more with what James just said. It's no surprise to me that that's where the data is leaving us. As part of an organization that's 353 years young. So we've been around for a while, I think it's fair to say, with a 70% holding by the family. There's always been this eye on purpose sort of at the center of who we are and what we do. And when we look at our demographics, I would agree with what James stated. We look and say 50% of our workforce will be millennials over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. That's our prediction. And we know from our exit and our intro interviews and onboarding efforts that one of the number one questions that our candidates are asking is, what are you doing in the ESG space? What's your work that you're running from an environmental perspective, especially because we're in the life sciences and health business. People really want to understand. We're working with things that they want to know. If I work here, can I stand by credibly and say I'm working for a good company? So defining that is very critical. From a DE&I perspective, which is what I kind of oversee, we're also seeing an uptick there. And that is a result of a lot of what's going on, not only in the US, we're seeing what's going on in countries around the globe from a social injustice perspective. And I think that that's influencing as well how we make this an environment where people really want to belong. And what they want to know is they want transparency of data. That's a very important component. And that's not very easy because in some countries and some jurisdictions, you can't self-ID as much. much. So you run into things. So I think as a management team and as a leader, I'm always trying to move the bar a little bit. I'm very proud that at our organization, for the first time in September of last year, we expanded our dimensions around some of our ESG work in DE&I beyond just gender parity. We are trying to work for that, but we've expanded those dimensions around inclusivity. What are we doing to build a more inclusive workforce, as well as building around equitability in the sense of culture and ethnicity? So what are we doing to build and support our underrepresented communities within our organization? So I'll talk a little bit more as we have our conversation about how we're building community within our organization. But what we're finding is that they're not only doing it to check a box, they're actually making a job decision, as James mentioned, as to whether or not they want to join your organization. For us, we're proud to say that we advance human progress. That's a very big phrase and has a lot of meaning to it, but we need to make sure that we're advancing human progress, not saying we're doing. We got to be credible and walk the talk.
It reminds me so much of James. We had, all three of us had some previous conversations just kind of learning about this topic and space. And James, I have a note when you were kind of explaining this at the beginning about how this isn't just a hygiene issue anymore. This is now holding accountable, and what is the walking the walk look like and walking the talk look like. So it's interesting, or just noteworthy, that we now have data there. And to your points, Renee, about like fostering something as monumental as community, like it's not something that you can really just check a box. It actually has to be authentic. So I guess it's a question for James, but both of you, like, what are some of those very tangible metrics that we can use to start to measure progress and measure how well companies are staying accountable to their promises or delivering on this authenticity in their values? Maybe James, you want to take a stab first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's critical to answer that question to be able to define what your purpose is and actually do that very specifically. So, purpose and ESG are strategically linked. Purpose answers the question of why your company exists. What positive impact you want to have on the world as an organization? Why do your employees get out of bed in the morning and come to work? And that particularly that issue has become a big one. And that usually then is underpinned by purposeful activity, which would often then take the form of an environment, social, or government factor. And so, being very specific about what your purpose is, then you can start to decide, actually, well, this is the world that we want to impact, and this is the progress and the difference we want to make. And of course, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So you've also got to be specific around what those environment, social, and government KPIs are. It's interesting that the word social in ESG has been a big conversation in places like Davos, where it's been much easier to measure environmental and governance related kind of factors as opposed to the social one, because environment, for example, that we would talk about how much recycling you're doing, how much waste you're creating, how much CO2, for example, it might be that your organization releases to be able to do its business, whereas some of those social pieces have often been quite sort of soft metrics. And so how do you get to a point where you can actually start to understand the difference you're making to the social part of your business? And so ensuring that you've got a strong sense of purpose, then setting out what you're going to achieve and be very measurable in terms of what those outcomes are in terms of ESG is hugely important. And it's more important today than ever, because ESG is being used by investors and stakeholders to value a business. And so, if they're putting a value on that is then kind of obviously going to have a direct impact on how successful your business is going to be or can be.
Sure. Renee, a two-pronged question here. From a employee engagement aspect, is it engagement or outreach in attracting your talent? And then off of that, when you're building these communities to share values and find the commonalities, is the question first, who do you want to be as a company, or is it who do your employees and your talent say you are based upon their shared values? Like, which comes first?
I think I would categorize it in two different ways. So I would categorize it into enrollment and authenticity. So let me start with the enrollment. So is it about engagement? I also oversee our employee engagement for the network. And you can get lots of people engaged in lots of things, but in my opinion, you then result with a big population potentially of individuals that I call dissatisfied compromisers. They kind of just sit there, they're with the organization, they're moving along, they may be doing their job very fine, but they're not very engaged in necessarily what needs to be done. Enrolling them is more of the action than they are willing to take to kind of be a participant in the cause that you're trying to move forward. So, intrinsically in our business, we make drugs, we help companies make drugs, and we provide, equipment, tools, and services in the electronics and in the industry, like the semi industry, that is remarkable. So by nature, we advance human progress. So we have a pretty good purpose as a company. I think what employees now want is more than that. And this is what we're talking about on the ESG. They want to know that you're also giving and enriching individuals in their professional development journey, in their communities. So our ERGs have expanded. We have probably about 10% to 15% of our employees who are involved actively in an ERG, and ERG is an employee resource group. So like women in leadership, leaders of color, our international community. People want to know that even if their manager or people within their line are not of the same ethnicity as them, the culture, race, gender, sexual orientation, that they have a community to go through. You can't just say you do ESG if you're kind of not balancing these other components in the organization. That's what I mean when I say authenticity. And I think that that's a big component. Maybe the last thing in both these categories, both on the data piece, on the enrollment, and on the authenticity, we are businesses. So sometimes we're a little more risk adverse to doing things. And let's just be honest amongst ourselves, although investors in the outside world are having us be accountable for some of these things, there is risk in disclosure of certain demographics, certain data points, certain information. And you have to get, a risk tolerance within your organization that everyone feels a little bit comfortable with, right? And that's uncomfortable. And so I spend a lot of my time aligning the organization around why we're doing something, and not just because the employees want us to do it or it's the right thing to do. It's what's nurturing the growth engine for the business going forward for candidates that are in our organization and for candidates that are coming into our organization. So it's an expectation that we're doing this as authentically as possible. So I think as we kind of move along this journey, it's not just about sending out an engagement survey. You also really have to follow feedback. You can't just get like feedback fatigue. You can't just keep surveying people and asking them the same thing. You got to take the feedback and then you got to reiterate in your organization. And that's why I think having some transparent metrics that you can stand by that are achievable as you move along is a key component of success in this area.
You just touched on kind of what was going to be my next question, which was, it feels very one-on-one to say, how do you get the feedback? Are you sending out a survey monkey? What is it? But really, how do you start this process?
I think like anyone else, a good organization is going to inquire amongst their population, amongst their communities, what it is they're sensing and feeling in the company and how do they want to move the needle. Yes, we use traditional surveys. We use very progressive, larger assessments about how included do employees feel. So it's not just about, do you like your manager? Do you enjoy working with your manager? Do you feel like this is a good workplace? We've kind of been much more oriented about the inclusion perspectives, and we're asking them perspectives both from an internal perspective and an external perspective. And, I think as a company, you have to make a decision once you get this feedback. You're either going to be, there's three categories. You're either sort of a supporter in the ESG space, a partner, like kind of middle of the road, or you're progressive, right? And not every company is going to be progressive. And I think you have to be, though, true to what you are. And that's what I always say to people. If, we might not ever be the most progressive company on some topics, but we're going to do what's right for our business, for our customers, for our employees, and make sure that we're doing it for the communities in which we live and work. And as long as we stay true to that, I think that then your employees then can make a decision. Is this the place I want to be or not? And I think we have to kind of just make sure the marriage of the purpose with the actions together kind of brings that along. And you get a lot of that insight from the feedback and from the surveys. A lot of people say to me, oh, well, there's feedback fatigue. I don't believe in a survey fatigue. I believe there's feedback fatigue. I think people give input and feedback. And we as communicators, I'm wearing my other hat, have to do a good job of marrying how that feedback results in action and next steps.
Thanks. James, your role a lot at Red Havas in advising brands in this way is to sort of take the fruits of Renee's labor or other company partners' labors and translate that from an investor standpoint, or show where the value lies within a company or how successful they're being at something. And I'm wondering what that how do you grasp that conversation to relay, the effectiveness, but also when some of these things take time, there's not immediate ROI always on them. There is a process to implementing, there's a process to gaining feedback, there's a process to building community. If it's a real community and sense of community, it's not happening overnight. So how does that conversation look, or how do maybe it's metrics that you're putting in place along the way, or benchmarks, but what do those elements look like?
Well, Renee talked about transparency of data, but I think there's also something about transparency of the story. And, you're right. A lot of these things, aren't a silver bullet. They don't happen, fast. It's purpose often is a decade plus long sort of journey for many organizations. Obviously, we're working with organizations all over the world, but on both sides of this, actually, in terms of, corporations that are looking to improve how they operate in their society and communities, but also with, NGOs and government organizations who are also acting as agents of change in this. And I think it's worthwhile being transparent about the story about what isn't working, because it's not just about, obviously everyone wants recognition for great work, but there's also, I think, amongst a lot of organizations, they want to learn best practice, but also want to learn about what didn't work. And I think, there's often a story in actually, we tried these things and they didn't work out, and actually being kind of quite open and transparent about that, and so that people can learn from it. So, or, a rising tide floats all boats in terms of, approaches to certain, ESG related factors, as we spoke about earlier. But, it's about sort of crafting what that story is and how that's going to affect the particular stakeholders of that organization. And so, why are we communicating about what we're doing in the purpose space? What is the outcome that we want to see? Is it because we want to be, a more attractive place for talent? Is it because we want to attract a younger consumer or a more diversified consumer? You need it. Everybody's got, a different set of circumstances and objectives with this. And I think that's important too, because there isn't a cookie cutter approach to this anymore. When we've gone past the days of, sort of greenwashing and purpose washing, at least in terms of in the more experienced markets, in terms of stakeholders and media holding you accountable to them. I'm not saying it doesn't happen anymore. Of course it does in different parts of in different parts of business and different parts of the world. But I think it has matured now into a space where the expectations have shifted, particularly in the last couple of years since COVID. There is an expectation now from communities that is different. There's an expectation from employees that are different. So there's an expectation from shareholders that is different now. So every organization has their own story, and it's our job then to help them craft it to deliver on whatever their objectives might be.
Certainly. And in a earlier conversation, you had shared with me kind of your personal thoughts about as we enter into the possibility of an economic downturn, how this timing and this moment is actually a pivotal point for these conversations. And there may be even a temptation to dial back or scale back in certain areas, when in actuality, this is such a critical time for commitment to these values. And so much so that companies that are as the most authentic and most true to themselves, in your perspective, might be the most successful.
Yeah, we believe strongly, and there's a lot of data points that backs this up, that if an organization that is giving back to society is better placed to be successful, full stop. And it's even more so best placed when you're going through a crisis. But right now, what we need is, if people want to be leaders, they need to step up and lead and actually demonstrate why they have a title of CEO or have a market leading title in their brand. We're obviously still in a pandemic. We're still facing issues around social justice and equity. We're still facing big issues in climate change. When we look at what's happening in Mississippi at the minute, or in Pakistan, it's happening all over the world. We're now looking at potential economic downturn. It is now incumbent on those organizations that really want to be seen as leaders to get out in front of this and really demonstrate that purpose is more than a word. It is part of the fabric of their organization.
Sure.
Maybe I can add on that too, Megan. I think that what you're saying, James, is the mobilization of the employee base to why you're doing this is very important. And I'll give you a really good example, which I've mentioned before, which is I'm proudly one of the sponsors. About 6 years ago, we introduced a mobile shipping container called our Curiosity Cube that goes to underrepresented communities to encourage STEM and STEM and women and underrepresented youth around the US. It originated, and we've now taken the cube on the road. And originally, when the idea came to me, I kind of was like, a shipping container around. I thought insurance risk. How are we going to do this? What is this really going to get us? But when you talk about purpose and marrying purpose and building brand, well, now we have this at the time of a rebranding launch of the company, this shipping container, which now creates inquiry, and people are like, oh, what is that? And you're kind of doing good things. And then we tied into it a mandate slowly around the organization for giving our employees volunteer hours at the company expense that they can then volunteer at the Cube. And the other day, a colleague of mine who continues to champion this wrote a LinkedIn about a gentleman in our organization who said, I'm sorry, I can't talk with you right now. I'm sparking curiosity and volunteering in our communities. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check it out. And then the website, and talk about brand and purpose coming together, right? And the fact that the manager approved the time off, the company supports the time off, the individual goes and takes a breather, because we also have this time of mental wellness and health and well-being that I think is also compounding this. So it's not just ESG because the investors want it and the world wants it and the CEO should be doing the right thing. It's also the fact that you can kind of be a catalyst to kind of get those employees to be working as part of it. And I think the rewards there, salary and compensation, benefits, all still very, very high on the list. But we're also saying that this is very high on the list too. The ability for them to give back and to participate and be a participant in the purpose, I think, is a critical component of what we're seeing of change. And we need to nurture that in our businesses. And it does pay back to the brand.
I personally want to track down the Curiosity Cube and figure it out. Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. I guess you've already just answered a number of my questions in a row right there, which was, how do you instill that desire or shared passion for common ground? And I'll leave us with one last question for you, Renee. You've spoken a lot about finding the commonality and how we've, in the past historically focused so much on identifying differences and tracking those differences to make sure that there's inclusion, but shifting the conversation and the perspective to what are our shared values. And if you could just speak, I think it's just interesting for people here to hear your perspective on building those commonalities. And you say it much better than I do, but if you'd share your perspective there.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality for me is that you could have many metrics in this ESG category, and every day it's changing. There'll be things that are required by the countries, the states, the government, and those aspects. But you have to kind of reflect and have some of this transparency in what you're trying to measure and move towards be homegrown. What I mean by that is we did a lot over the last 3 years, especially post, some traumatic circumstances around the globe, have very real, authentic conversations with our employee base and really listen to them and helped their insights and input shape the way the ESG targets are set and how we work to achieve them. Because it's not just about kind of doing the fun things, and this is hard work. You have to, from a sustainability perspective in our business, adapt processes, change the way people think, really look at science from a different perspective. That's going to impact climate change and the environmental factors. From a social perspective, we've had employee bases that have been large populations in certain regions around the world. And now we're saying we're going to be more intentional about the deeper, look that we're taking to kind of diversify the employee base. And we're going to ensure that we have these communities where people can have these, really honest discussions. So I think this component of really making sure that it's not just a top down, these are our targets, having the communities and the organizations help you to be part of the fabric of building that is going to be critical for success as we move forward. And I think it enrolls them in really ensuring that we're delivering what we say to the credibility of walking the talk.
I love it. I'll end on one closing question that this has sort of, your last thoughts sort of prompted. No right or wrong answer, but for both of you, with that perspective, is it the employer's responsibility to educate the community and their employees on these topics that are very critical, or is it their role to listen to the community and determine where their priorities stand?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's both, right? Because, and I think this is true of all agents of change, and businesses can be an agent of change, and the same way that our governmental leaders can be, our leaders in society are. But you are only going to affect change if you listen and then you act. And so it requires both. I don't think it's a one or the other answer. At least that's my point of view.
I'd have to agree with James that it is both. And I do think maybe though right now we're in the world of educating, both on all fronts, right? We're learning, we're moving minds here. We have mindset shifts that have to be made. And many of these businesses have been very successful over time. And with the downturn potentially coming and with the world a certain way, we have to kind of be a little bit more savvy and really educating ourselves and the employee base so that there's a better understanding of where we are. And like I've said before, we're a lot more alike than we are different, especially in our companies and our employees. And we just got to find that commonality and figure out a common ground to move forward.
A great closing thought. Thank you both for being with us. This is Renee Connolly of Merck KGaA and James Wright of Red Havas. Thank you both. It's been a great episode.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right, take care. This has been the PRovoke Media Podcast, and I'm Megan Miller.